Welcome back, amazing parents, to Programming Your Child for Success. In the last video, we began learning how to apply these concepts in practical situations, and we learned how to create behavior with using just our words. And so in this lesson, I want to talk about how to shape character in the same way. It's all so simple. Once you understand the concepts and see it in action, it just becomes very simple. Now, it isn't easy because, as I mentioned in the last video, we automatically default to our flesh reactive mode rather than our spirit proactive mode. So it takes a conscious decision. Even after doing it for years, I have to make a conscious decision not to react in my flesh, but to walk in this spirit and speak life over my child, over my children, and destiny. So in this one, we're going to talk about shaping character. And I have a very profound story to share in regards to this topic. So I can't wait to get to that. So first of all, your identity in Christ includes godly character. So everything from being obedient, helpful, honest, kind, respectful, you name it, hardworking, all those character traits are included in your child's true identity. So what we have to do is the same thing when we see behavior we don't like, when we see character traits we don't like, we have to look beyond the natural and speak their true identity to them. So, for example, you want your child to be helpful and you ask them to do things, but they, in their flesh, they respond and they're often resistant and they say, no, I don't want to, no, whatever. That's their flesh. So you have to remind them who they really are. When you see that, don't react. Rise up in your spirit and go, oh no, that isn't who you are. You are helpful. You always help me. I love how you pick up your toys. You're so helpful with your brother. And just speaking, it becomes part of your natural conversation that you're always speaking identity into your child. So in the face of, remember, you have to walk by faith. So in the face of seeing the opposite in the natural, you have to speak what you want. And it's very awkward. I had in one of my courses, one of my live workshops a few years ago, I had a pastor and he had a 3-year-old daughter, and for 2 years they had been trying to get her to stop this destructive behavior with one of their pets. And so I just trained him on this really quickly, and I said, try telling her you like how she's so gentle with the cat, because she would try to strangle the cat. And sure enough, he did just that, and the results were immediate. After 2 years of speaking to her behavior, the external, nothing changed. They tried everything, timeouts, spankings, you name it, blah, blah, blah. Nothing changed. If she was alone in the room with the cat, they'd find her and they'd hear the cat screech and they'd go in there, and they were afraid for her safety. Thankfully, the cat never scratched her eyes out. But as soon as he spoke to her true identity and he told her who she really was, you are so gentle with the cat. I love how you pet the cat so gently. That's all he said. And he said, I walked out of the room. He didn't even try to go over and change the situation. But you'll find that they respond so immediately. The younger they are, the easier they respond, because they don't have any ideas yet. They're just responding automatically, just like a computer. Remember, we talked about kids are more like computers than they are like miniature adults. An adult would think about it and go, no, I'm not. Even an older child, I'm not being gentle, but they don't argue with it. Whatever you tell them, they believe it. And immediately she responded. He came back a few minutes later and he said, Amy, I couldn't believe it. She was sitting there petting the cat. But you know what? He said when he spoke those words, it felt so awkward. And it will feel awkward because your flesh is so used to defining things by what it can see. And so your spirit is now beginning to take over, and your flesh is like, what? Your natural man argues with the truth. So you just have to ignore that. It's going to feel awkward. But as you're going to see in a minute when I share this story, that the more you do it, the more you start believing it, and the easier it becomes. So when your child, in the face of him being greedy, tell him he's generous. In the face of him being messy, tell him he's neat. In the face of him being irresponsible, tell him he's responsible. In however you want to say it. And make this part of your natural conversation every day. And also you can speak these things when you see your child displaying it. So when your child helps clean up the toys, just out of the blue, thank you so much for always picking up your toys. So you're reaffirming. Now, but you don't, you see a lot of, or you hear parenting training that says that's the way to create the behaviors you want, is catch your child doing what you want and then affirm it. But you don't have to wait until you see it, because as sons of God, as children of God, we have the ability to create what we want. And so you don't have to wait. In the midst of him being rebellious, tell him he's so obedient. And it's amazing. So, but also when you see him doing it, thank him for being that way. Tell him, oh, you're always so helpful. Thank you for clearing your dishes. It may be something they do every day that you've already trained them to do. Oh, you're so good at taking your bath. Maybe they're kicking and screaming and they don't want to take a bath, little one. You're so good at taking your bath. Thank you for being so helpful. And it becomes a game, but it takes so much pressure off of you, because in the past we thought we had to be policemen and point out everywhere where our children fall short. And it's draining. It drains you. It drains them. It's discouraging. You have such a negative outlook on your child, and all you can see is what he's not. So now we're going to start seeing who he really is in the spirit and calling that forth into the natural, speaking it into existence. All right. So we have to tell them who they really are. And so I want to tell you a story about how this played out in my own life. And this is actually when the Lord really began teaching me this, and I began understanding these concepts. And, I told you when my son was a newborn, how I told him he was a good eater and how that changed things in 2 days. Well, that lesson didn't really stick with me. I didn't continue using this tool until about 18 to 24 months later. My son was just about 2 years old, I think, and he wasn't quite walking yet, so just under 2 years old. He walked when he was 2. But he was in that age where they love to say no. And we always think that that's rebellion. And honestly, it is not. It's a healthy developmental stage of where they're learning, they have their own voice. And the last thing you want to do is make them feel like saying no is bad, because you're taking away their most basic boundary when you do that. And that's from Henry Cloud, and in his book, Boundaries. The word no is our most basic boundary. And if you take that away from a child, he can never say no. He becomes a doormat at best, a victim at worst. So we need to learn to, again, just step right over that no. And in this story, you'll see how I did that, and just speak to the truth, right? So my son was about 18 months, 2 years old, and he loved to tip things over. And he had tipped everything in our house that wasn't nailed down. And he had broken small items like portable stereos, back in the day when we had those. And small tables, lamps, floor lamps, forget it. All those things were moved into closets because he would tip them over and ultimately break them. And so there was one thing, though, that I really couldn't put out of reach, and that was my piano bench. And it was the nicest thing I owned. Someone had given me this piano, and I had 5 kids at home at the time. I was homeschooling. Our house was anything but a showroom. It was neat, but it was a workspace. And so I had this piano as kind of my prized possession. And well, one day he had tipped the piano bench over. If you know anything about piano benches, they're top heavy because you store the music in the seat. So once you get it past that point of whatever you call it, balance, it tips and it goes down pretty hard. And so he had done that a couple times, and the hinges were becoming broken and starting to come loose. And so I had warned him, don't tip over my piano bench, right? That's what we do. But as we learned earlier in this course, that children live in the moment. That's why they don't remember what you tell them yesterday. It isn't that they're being defiant. They don't remember. So when you say, how many times do I have to tell you? Well, if you're going to approach parenting from behavior management perspective, you're going to have to tell them every time. And usually you're telling them after the fact, because it could be a moment ago, but they live literally in the moment. Yesterday's forgotten, tomorrow doesn't exist. So I told him, because I hadn't really understood these things yet, don't tip over my piano bench. Well, I come in the living room one day, and of course the inevitable had happened. He tipped it over, and at this point he was across the room happily playing with something else. He'd moved on, and he'd had his tipping fun, and he was doing something else. And there lay my piano bench hanging on, the lid was hanging on by a last thread, and one hinge had completely broken off. And so I was pretty livid, and I wasn't, angry, but I was upset. And so I did what we typically do when we react to the natural circumstances rather than responding in the spirit. I reacted, and I, put my hands on my hip, and I said, Jonathan, you get over here right now. I told you blah, 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 blah. I went into my mom rant, and he had his back turned toward me. He looks over his shoulder at me, and he sees my demeanor, and he was like, no, I'm not coming over there. That doesn't look like a fun place to be. Mom doesn't look happy. So then I inserted his middle name, Jonathan David, you get over here right now, because we always think that has more impact. And then he kind of folds his arms. So his body language continued to show that he was totally resistant to my demand that he come over here right now. And I was going to have a talking to with him. Like that would do any good, right? And so finally, after about 2 or 3 of these demands, I realized this wasn't going to work. And so again, I just stopped, and I kind of just under my breath, I said, Lord, I don't know what to do. I've never had a special needs child before. And at the time, I didn't know that all kids were wired this way, but I had managed my other kids fairly well. And so again, I hear the Lord speak to me in my heart. He said, tell him he's obedient. And I was like, what? And then I remembered the incident with when he was 2 weeks old, telling him he was a good eater. And I thought, oh yeah, that worked then. Let me try it. So I kind of gained my composure. I pasted a phony smile on my face. And as best as I could, I, tried to sound positive. And I said, Jonathan, you're so obedient. And immediately, I'm telling you, immediately when I said those words, you are obedient, I saw something in him just like perk up. It was sorry, my phone is, something in him responded. And I know now that it was his spirit. It was like, it's like, oh, yes, that's who I am. And so when we call our kids disobedient and all of those negative things, they resist it because deep down they know that's not who they are. Deep down they're waiting for us to say who they really are, tell them who they really are, and to reawaken their true identity. So at the time, I didn't really realize what was going on, but I saw his reaction. And so when I saw his reaction, that built my faith. So then I'm more relaxed, and I'm thinking, okay, there was something going on here. So I said it again, this time a little more faith in my voice. Jonathan, you're so obedient. And I'm smiling now, but it's more of a natural smile, a real smile. And so he stands up. And he turns around to face me. And I see him responding in the physical to my words. So now I'm like super pumped. And I'm grinning from ear to ear. And I say, Jonathan, you are so obedient. You always do what mommy says. And every time I tell this story, I get goosebumps because it was so incredible. It's like I can feel it again. And all of a sudden, he bursts into a grin, runs across the room, and flings his arms around my neck. Now, mind you, at this point, I did not tell him to come over to me. I just told him who he was. I just told him he was obedient. And as I'm sitting here just wondering, what in the world did I just discover? And I'm holding him and he's hugging me. It took me, a little while for me to understand what actually had happened. And so as I'm figuring this out, later, I'm like, wow. Well, then for the next 2 weeks, about 2 weeks after that, whenever I told him to do something, he would say the automatic toddler response, which is no. But because I understood that this was a healthy, natural developmental stage and that he wasn't being defiant, he was actually practicing his independence and using his own voice. We want our kids to be independent. That's the goal. We want them to have their own voice. We don't want to take away their voice. We don't want to take away their most basic boundary. And so I just recognized that for what it was. He wasn't really saying no to me. He was just practicing. And the only way that a 2-year-old knows how to practice his independence is by using that word no. And sometimes if they're a little smarter, they might add a little more to it. But that's what all they're doing. And so I just calmly, I just stepped right over that, figuratively. And I would just say, you always do what mommy says. And I would go about what I was doing, just expecting him to do what I had said. For example, I was in the kitchen one day and I was fixing some food and he walked in the room and I turned to him and I said something like, I don't know, I'll make something up because I don't remember what it was. Go get your shoes, Jonathan. And he said, no. And I looked at him and I go, you always do what mommy, you're so obedient. You always do what mommy says. Again, just reminding him of who he really is. And so I went back to fixing food. So my body language is saying, I expect you to do what I said. Instead of me standing there waiting and watching him and wondering if he's going to do it. No, I'm walking by faith, believing that that's who he really is. So I had to do that maybe for 2 weeks after the initial incident where I told him he was obedient. And then after that, never had to remind him who he was again. And to this day, he's 20 years old. He has Down syndrome, so he's still kind of like a dependent. To this day, if I tell him what to do, he does it immediately without even thinking. It's automatic because I programmed it in his heart when he was little. And so he'll never stop being that way because it's encoded on his software. So isn't that incredibly powerful? I mean, I'm telling you, this stuff is so life-changing. So we're creating spiritual identity. And I wanted to share also that this works with adult children as well. All of our children are waiting for us to tell them who they are. So if your children are grown or you have grown children and little children or whatever, take heart. I did this with one of my adult children, and I won't go into the whole story because I don't want this video to get too long. But you still have authority over them. They're still your children, even though they could be married and moved on. And you can get God's word for their life, just have a time with Father, or maybe after they've grown, you kind of see their identity. You know what their strengths are. You kind of see their callings maybe. But if they're not walking in it, if they're not being who they really are, you can write out just an identity statement about your adult children. And because there's no time or distance in the spirit, you can speak to their spirit just in your quiet time, in your secret place, just speaking out, like decreeing it in your kingly authority, because we're kings and priests, right? We have dominion on the earth, and God has given us a domain to rule and reign over it. And how does a king rule? By decree. He says it, and it is so. So I've seen this work in my adult children as well, and it was within 2 weeks, saw a very difficult situation turn around just by decreeing things over my daughter. So I think we're going to stop there, and I'll do another video to kind of finish up this lesson. There's a few more things I want to say about it, but just remember, your kids are waiting for you to tell them who they really are. So don't keep them waiting. All right, I'll see you in the next video.